There is no worse feeling than drafting a ridiculously good fantasy football team, making it all the way to the fantasy playoffs, and then they just take a dump. But there is no logical reason in not drafting high-performing players just because they struggle end of season. Instead, draft those players. Take advantage of their higher early season production. But just before their late season implosion, trade them off to one of your dumb league mates instead. Come on now, as soon as I said dumb league mates, a name popped into your head. It's okay, we all have them. And in today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the running back position, look at some of their production over the last couple of years, and try to find those guys that had the biggest increase and decrease in production during the fantasy playoffs. So let me tell you how we're going to go ahead and do this. I took the current consensus top 30 overall running backs for 2024. I then went through and figured out how many fantasy points on average did they score in 2022 and 2023 between the weeks 1 and 14. That's the fantasy regular season. Then I went through and found out how many average fantasy points they scored for those same years in weeks 15 through 17, the fantasy playoffs. We then just take the difference of the two numbers, find out the percentage of production that either increased or decreased. It's super simple, but don't worry, I'm not going to sit here and make you do math. I did it all for you. Now, typically when we do exercises like this, I like to use 3-year averages. But when it comes to running backs, we have so many running backs that really only have 1 season worth of data. I only limited it to 2 years for this episode. Some only had 1 year of data because they were a rookie last year. Guys like Benjon Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Devonta Anan. How about some other guys that dealt with some past injuries like Breece Hall, Jonathan Taylor, Josh Jacobs? But it's gonna work out just fine. Remember, we don't just blindly follow data. This is nothing else but just another tool in our tool belt. What we need to do is take this data, find out what caused it to happen, and then see how it applies to the 2024 season. There are so many fantasy football players that really just refer to what their players did in the previous year's playoffs. But that doesn't paint a clear picture. It's just what they have most recent in their memory. All right, but let's go ahead and start looking at some data first. Let's go ahead and bring up a list of the current consensus top 30 overall running backs. And we'll go ahead and kick it off with what they scored during the fantasy regular season. Remember, that's weeks 1 through 14 from 2022 and 2023. And here are the averages on the screen. We got the likes of Christian McCaffrey, averaging 20 fantasy points per game in the fantasy regular season over the last 2 years. Breece Hall at 13.8. Benjon Robinson, only 1 season there with 13 fantasy points per game on average in 2023. Jonathan Taylor, pretty freaking consistent at 13.2. Jahmyr Gibbs at 14.2. Saquon Barkley, consistent as well. 15 fantasy points per game last year, 15.8 in 2022 during the fantasy regular season. Then we had Kyren Williams, who was he was a league winner for people just last year, but he didn't have the largest role the year prior in 2022. Then we had Travis Etienne take a step forward in 23. How about Derrick Henry? A little bit better in 2022, but not bad whatsoever in 2023 with 14.1 fantasy points per game. Then Josh Jacobs, obviously he had a much better 22 than he did 23. Isaiah Pacheco, he's one of the only guys on the list that averaged sub 10 fantasy points per game during the regular season over the last 2 years. Really the only others on the list, James Cook at 8.45, but didn't really have a large role in 2022. Then we had Javonte Williams at 9.2 points, Jaylen Warren at 9.6. Obviously, Jaylen Warren, another one of those guys, didn't have a huge role in 2022, but also some other high finishers in here. We got guys like Joe Mixon averaging over 14 fantasy points per game. A lot of people forgot about Austin Eckler. Obviously, he did a lot of people dirty in 2023, but the guy still scores fantasy points when he's healthy and on the field. Now he's in Washington. Can we expect the same thing? He's averaged 16.05 fantasy points per game over the regular season the last 2 years. But all right, you can go ahead and see the rest of the averages here on the screen. Now let's talk about what they've scored in the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15 through 17 over the last 2 years. Right here at the top, Christian McCaffrey continues to dominate, averaging 22.7 fantasy points per game in your fantasy playoffs. Breece Hall, he averaged 20.8 fantasy points per game last season. Benjon only 8.6. Jonathan Taylor at 13.6 just last year. And then Jahmyr Gibbs at 16.9. Some other big time guys here as well. Kyren Williams. The dude was a league winner. We know he averaged 22.5 fantasy points per game in the fantasy playoffs just last year. Derrick Henry stepped up 15.2 fantasy points per game. As we go down the list, we can all of a sudden look at James Conner, a little bit lower on the list. He averaged 18.75 fantasy points per game in the fantasy playoffs over the last 2 years. Najee Harris over 14 fantasy points. Raheem, not quite a must. Yeah, he's damn near a must start. Raheem Mostert averaged 13.7 fantasy points per game. Austin Eckler, 14.25 here at the bottom of the list. But once again, you can really see not too many guys average sub 10 fantasy points. We had what? Benjon Robinson last year. Who else was there? We had Tony Pollard at 8.7 over the last 2 years. That kind of hurts a little bit. Javonte Williams at 6.6. We got, what else is here? Brian Robinson at 9.1. He's sub 10 in the fantasy playoffs. That's definitely a name to pay attention to because now him and Austin Eckler going to be fighting for those touches. But that's a lot of numbers to throw at you. Let's go ahead and simplify this a little bit. Let's go ahead and just take a look at the guys who had the biggest increases in production and decreases in production. Kicking it off first with the biggest increases at the top of the list. It was James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals with a 59% increase in production during the fantasy playoffs. But that was boosted up by a couple things in 2023. A lack of offensive weapons in Arizona is an obvious thing, right? There wasn't a whole lot else in Arizona. Their leading weapons in the passing game during that span were Greg Dortch and Elijah Higgins. A lot of people don't even know who the hell Elijah Higgins is, but it was also because of touchdowns. James Conner had 9 touchdowns all year long, but 4 of them came in the fantasy playoffs. But we also can't go without mentioning the volume that he's seen in the fantasy playoffs over the last couple of years. He's averaging 20 touches a game between the weeks of 15 and 17 over the last 2 seasons. But this is where it gets interesting. Arizona did just draft Trey Benson, and we can see him with a larger role in this offense as the season progresses. But they also brought in Marvin Harrison Jr., they've brought in Zay Jones, we know they already have Trey McBride. But I really believe this comes down to health. If James Conner hits the middle of the season and he is still fully healthy, I think he has another late season run in him. If he misses any time, if he gets banged up, if we start to see more and more Trey Benson each and every week, we're probably going to need to jump off the bandwagon of James Conner before the end of the season. He's definitely a name to pay close attention to. What about Breece Hall? He's seen a 51% increase during the fantasy playoffs. Now, y'all know, if you've watched this show for any length of time, I love me some Breece Hall. But I gotta be totally honest. His big increase in the playoffs last year was solely due to his work in the pass-catching game. He had 16 targets, 12 receptions, and that was just in week 16 alone. 191 total yards and a touchdown against the worst defense in the NFL last season, the Washington Commanders. But it was a big game in week 17 as well, where he had 9 targets, 9 receptions, 126 total yards, and a receiving touchdown. Now, while I think Breece Hall eats all year long, I really don't think we can expect 25 targets in 2 of the 3 fantasy playoff games yearly. That is a ridiculously high number. The Jets have upgraded their offensive line though, and it wouldn't shock me whatsoever if Breece is used more and more as the weather turns to the winter months. I can totally buy into him being a late season threat once again in 2024. What about James Cook of the Buffalo Bills? He sees a 48% increase in the fantasy playoffs, and this right here is directly related to volume over the last 2 seasons. He had a much bigger role last year in 2023 than he had in 2022. Plus, his usage climbed as soon as they changed offensive coordinators from Ken Dorsey to Joe Brady in 2023. But it was also just one big game in 2023 that really boosted his average in the fantasy playoffs. It was week 15. He had 221 total yards and 2 touchdowns. The other games, week 16 and 17, he had a combined total of 114 yards and no touchdowns. Now, obviously, Buffalo has lost some bigger names in their offense over the last year, right? Stephon Diggs, Gabe Davis, but they've brought in the likes of Keon Coleman in the draft. We know about Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, Dalton Kincaid. There are options in this offense, and we also know that Josh Allen likes to run a lot too. When I look at James Cook, I can't just pencil him in every single year as somebody who's going to carry me to a fantasy championship between the weeks of 15 through 17. If he's firing on all cylinders by midseason, 3/4 of the way, by the time the trade deadline comes, he might be a guy that I try to capitalize on. Which then brings us to Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he's seen a 40% increase during the fantasy playoffs. And this one right here is a little intriguing to me. He has averaged more fantasy points per game in the regular season and the fantasy playoffs in 2023 than he did in 2022. But what makes that weird is in 2023, Jaylen Warren had a much bigger role overall in this offense. But the fact remains this: Najee ate in weeks 16 and 17 last year. 46 carries for 200 yards rushing and 3 rushing touchdowns over those 2 games. Najee is one of the few running backs on this list that saw a noticeable increase in fantasy playoffs in each of the last 2 seasons. Now, Pittsburgh, they've already shown that they want to run the ball a lot this season. They boosted their offensive line during the NFL draft. We know their quarterback play, it's going to be much improved for 2024, and boxes aren't going to be crowded. We also know we have a new offensive coordinator in Arthur Smith, who wants to run the football a lot. And we've seen both Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris coexist in an offense before. Now, when cold weather and tough, hard-nosed late-season division games are up, we could see a ton of Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, and they could be some late-season heroes for us this year. Which then brings us to Isaiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs. He sees a 38% increase during the fantasy playoffs. Now, it is worth noting that in 2022, Isaiah Pacheco played less than 50% of the offensive snaps during the fantasy playoffs. And then, last season in 2023, he missed week 15, but was really saved by a huge week 17, where he had a total 165 yards and a touchdown. My biggest concern with Isaiah Pacheco at this point is durability. The dude runs like the grass called his mama fat. It leads to him racking up a bunch of nagging injuries as the season goes on. Kansas City also has more viable wide receiver weapons to throw to this year. Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy, maybe, probably not Rashee Rice, but we still don't know for sure. We also have Travis Kelce. That we do know. I love this kid, but I'm not buying late season heroics from him yearly. And then lastly, Jaylen Warren saw a 22% increase during the fantasy playoffs. Didn't have a large enough role to really measure in 2022 though. Not a huge increase in 2023, but we talked about this team and we talked about Najee Harris just a couple minutes ago. Now, when I look at Jaylen Warren, not a guy I really look at as a late season playoff push type player, more so just a solid contributor. But it wasn't all great, right? We know there's some players out there that just don't perform as well in the fantasy playoffs. Now, before we get into those names, just a quick reminder. Our draft guide is currently for sale right now on tfhdraftguide.com. There's links down below in the description. If you want to absolutely dominate fantasy football in 2024, this is how you do it. Now, for the first time ever, our draft guide includes dynasty content and redraft content, and we didn't raise the price whatsoever. It's already live, there's already content there, we're going to continue adding to it, and on top of all of that, it's going to get updated frequently from now up until week 1 of the NFL season. They are absolutely flying off the virtual shelves, and you don't want to miss out on it. Head over to tfhdraftguide.com. But let's go ahead and dive in to a few of the players that have seen the biggest decrease in production during the fantasy playoffs. The first one up, Devonta Anan of the Miami Dolphins. And this one probably shouldn't shock a lot of people. It's because he started off so hot, but he did see a 41% decrease in production. He just set that bar so high early in the season, it would have been impossible to keep up that momentum. But this is really going to come down to his health for me 100% of the time, each and every year. Raheem Mostert, he's getting older. He's on the wrong side of 30, but they did just draft running back Jalen Wright out of Tennessee. This offense, though, we already know is one of the most high-powered, highest-scoring offenses in football, and they can support multiple running backs in this offense. I don't care about any other variable when it comes to Devonta Anan outside of health. If he is healthy and he is on the field, he is going to produce no matter what time of the year it is. It's just whether or not he can stay healthy. Next up, Tony Pollard, a 38% decrease in production during the fantasy playoffs. This one, not really a shocker to me for the reason that we've talked about for years on this channel. He's going to struggle and be less efficient the more and more overworked he is. And we saw that at the end of 2022 with a Zeke injury. We saw it at the end of 2023 last year in Dallas when he was the man. But now he's in Tennessee and he's taking over for a departed Derrick Henry. We have a new coaching staff that actually brought in Tony Pollard. Tajay Spears is not their guy. But they also added a ton of weapons in the pass-catching game. They brought in Calvin Ridley. They brought in Tyler Boyd. They want to throw the ball, and we know that Tony Pollard can catch passes out of the backfield. So it's no different than what we've said for years. If they run Tony Pollard into the ground early in the season, I will not be surprised if he wilts down the stretch once again. Pay close attention to his usage the first half of the season. If he's racking up huge numbers of touches, he may be somebody to say sayonara to before it starts to go downhill. How about Benjon Robinson? He saw a 34% decrease in production, but really only 1 year to go off of. It was with an Arthur Smith offense that was absolutely horrendous. Can we really hold it against him? Because what really killed Benjon in the fantasy playoffs last year was a lack of touchdowns. And he also played against solid run defenses in Carolina and Chicago over that span. But now we have a new coaching staff, which is an absolute plus. We're going to have improved quarterback play with Kirk Cousins, which is a huge plus to a running game. I expect Benjon Robinson to increase in basically everything across the board, and I'm not worried about some type of late season fall off for Benjon Robinson. All right, what about Joe Mixon, now of the Houston Texans? He's seen a 30% decrease in production during the fantasy playoffs, and this is more so because of him not being healthy the end of 2022. Last year in 2023, he averaged 13.7 fantasy points per game during the regular season and 12.8 fantasy points per game in the fantasy playoffs. But now that he moves to Houston, he's not taken a step backwards. This is still a high-powered offense that's full of playmakers, a team that could easily be playing with more leads in 2024, especially late in games, allowing Joe Mixon to rack up touches. But this offensive line in Houston is not great overall. Sure, they have some solid pieces, especially with Laramie Tunsil, but they also have some pieces that really need to bounce back and stay healthy in 2023. I don't think I can expect a huge jump in efficiency this year from Joe Mixon, but the volume, which is most important, should still be there. As for the end of season production, I'm really not that worried about it. Which will then take us to the next guy on the list. It's Josh Jacobs of now the Green Bay Packers. So many guys switching teams here, but he's seen a 28% decrease in production during the fantasy playoffs. Now, we all know he was injured towards the end of 2023, so he really couldn't help out his average last season at all. The end of 2022, he played games against the New England Patriots, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the San Francisco 49ers during the fantasy playoffs. So for the most part, their team was trailing and having to throw. They weren't overly relying upon Josh Jacobs, and it really hurt his end of season averages. When you have a bad team and a tough schedule, It's an absolute recipe for disaster in the fantasy playoffs, but now that he's in Green Bay, it's a much better overall offense there for the Packers. More opportunities for touchdowns in this offense, and Green Bay always has and always will continue to run the ball more as the winter months approach. When it's below zero and freezing and windy in Green Bay, they're going to run the football a lot, and that's going to be Josh Jacobs the end of 2024. I'm not expecting a yearly drop-off when it comes to the fantasy playoffs. And then lastly, Alvin Kamara also saw a 28% decrease in production. Now, Kamara used to be the guy in fantasy football that would win you fantasy titles because he would always go off towards the end of the season. That has just not been the case the last 2 years. And I'm really starting to think it's because head coach Dennis Allen just doesn't like the guy or something. Because he's really been a huge letdown ever since Dennis Allen took over. Kamara was a guy each and every year getting 100+ targets. 80+ receptions a season. That's not the case anymore. He hasn't had over 500 yards receiving now in 3 straight years. He's seen his yards per carry average absolutely plummet to under 4 yards. In fact, he had more touchdowns in 2020 alone than the last 3 seasons combined. He's getting the touches. He's getting the volume. He's just not going anywhere with it. I really don't think this is some late season type of thing. I think we just need to look at Alvin Kamara as more of a season-long boom or bust type player. All right, so there we have it, the running backs with the biggest increase and decrease in production during the fantasy playoffs over the last couple of years. Did any of these guys that we talked about today, did they help or hurt your fantasy team over the last couple of years? Remember, you can't just look at data at face value. You have to dig a little bit deeper. Find out why the production was there or was not there. Then just take it, apply it to the current year, and you try to make the best decisions possible for your fantasy football team. Do not, and I repeat, do not avoid a player on draft day just because you're worried about what they're going to do in the fantasy playoffs. If you don't build a team that can get to the fantasy playoffs, what are you worried about winning in the fantasy playoffs? It's those mid-season moves, those mid-season trades that can absolutely win you leagues. So if that's what you're looking for, be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, because we have you covered all year long with all things fantasy football. Now I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.